This is Amy, and you're listening to the Talking Appalachian podcast. So this is an exciting day for me because I'm interviewing one of my very favorite writers, Rash. Eighth novel, it's called The Caretaker, and I can tell you that it is one of the most beautiful novels he's written. I mean, they're all good. He's got 20 books total. He's got a collection of novels. He's got short stories. He's got poetry. He does it all. But this book just left me feeling really good, and I'm thinking about it so much, and I can't wait to talk to him about it, but I'm going to try not to spoil it. Ron contributed to part 2 of Talking Appalachian, the book. He contributed One Foot in Eden, which was one of his earlier novels. Those contributions in part 2 of the book were specifically about what it means to be a speaker of an Appalachian dialect. The authors that contributed creative writing chose pieces that reflected character either being judged by his or her accent or using it to empower themselves in some way. And so I'm just really looking forward to talking to him about dialect. He's from Western North Carolina. Most of his books, if not all, are set there in Western North Carolina. He teaches at Western North Carolina University. Here's a little bit more about Ron Rash. He's the author of the 2009 Penn Faulkner finalist and New York Times bestselling novel Serena. So Serena is also one of my favorite Ron Rash novels. It's phenomenal. It was made into a movie with Bradley Cooper and Jennifer Lawrence. In addition to the critically acclaimed novels The Risen, Above the Waterfall, The Cove, One Foot in Eden, Saints at the River, and The World Made Straight. And I believe The World Made Straight was also made into a movie. He has 5 collections of poems and 7 collections of stories, among them Burning Bright, which is amazing. I teach Burning Bright in my Appalachian Studies classes. I'm more of a novel reader than a short story reader, but this is one book of short stories that I will read over and over again. It's got one of my favorite stories called The Corpse Bird, which is set at Halloween. I always like to get it out and read at this time of year. He won the 2010 Frank O'Connor International Short Story Award, Nothing Gold Can Stay, a New York Times bestseller, and Chemistry Other Stories, which was a finalist for the 2007 Penn Faulkner Award. He's a 3 times recipient of the O. Henry Prize, and his books have been translated into 17 languages. As I said, this is going to be a real treat for those of you, especially who know Ron and his work. Welcome, Ron Rash.
Hi, Amy.
Hi. So how are you doing?
Good. I've just been on a book tour, finishing up. Actually, got an event tonight, got an event Sunday, an event Tuesday, and that'll be it. So, I've spent about a week and a half, 2 weeks, Mississippi, Georgia, Carolina.
You've been busy. Yeah. So I appreciate it.
No, I'm glad. Old friends, that's fine.
I was really excited when I saw you had this new novel coming out. What drew you into this particular story when you started writing?
Well, in some ways, I think it's my oldest novel because about 35 years ago, a friend of mine, good friend, was telling me a story. And the story was about a young man, teenager, who was in a small town, prominent family in the town, kind of the leading family, so as far as class. And he fell in love with a girl who was from a very poor background. Family was really against his being involved with her, and they eloped. So after the elopement, they still were kind of in the community. The parents were still very upset about it. But then he got drafted, went overseas to fight, and while he was gone, the family actually had her murdered. And the story kind of got a little bit vague after that, but some people in the community knew, but it never quite. I'll never, or at least when the guy told me the story, my friend told me the story, it wasn't really clear if the soldier had found out what really happened. They told her, they'd said that she died of natural causes, and that story had stayed with me. I thought, wow, what a great end for a novel. And as I got, kind of thinking about, all these years, I thought, eventually, surely I'm going to write something like that. And finally, about 7, 8 years ago, it kind of clicked. But in the novel, it really deals more with how far the family will go. I mean, because they're thinking about doing this, and the tension in the book is how far exactly will they go? Will they actually go through it? And also, of course, dealing with the novel actually beginning with Korea, because he's overseas when he gets word that his young wife, pregnant, has died. Okay. So yeah, that's where it began. But also early on, as I was working on the book, I had this image of a young woman dressed in mourning clothes at night in a cemetery. And I knew she was weeping, but she was kneeling in front of her own grave. And I knew somebody was watching her, and I did not know, is this a ghost? Is this a real woman? And I think, having read the book, you could see how that would tie in.
So this does take place in some scenes in a cemetery. And Blackburn is the caretaker, hence the title. Do you want to read that section now?
Sure. Yeah, Blackburn has actually been the caretaker since he's 16 years old. And his family has kind of deserted him, or not deserted him, but they've moved to Florida. He's kind of stayed behind. He's had polio as a child, and that's caused a lot of problems for him. Part of his face is partially still kind of paralyzed. And some problems walking, still a little slight limp. But this novel, I think, ultimately is about love. It's about love. Sometimes horrific acts justified in the name of love. It's about how people show their love, and particularly in this instance, because when Blackburn has polio as a child, his father, who's a very stern man, really pushes him to get him up and walking. And Blackburn's a child. He can't quite comprehend. Is his father just being brutal? His father's not going to be the kind that's going to say, "I love you so much, son."
Yeah.
I'm just trying to help you. No, the father rubbing the liniment, really doing it hard. But there's a moment a couple of years later after all that, when Blackburn suddenly, his father maybe for the first time actually vocalizes what he feels about his son. And this was kind of a fun scene to write, because I got to go back to those country stores that I used to go to.
Oh, yeah.
And one of the most vivid memories I have is, growing up was the old metal drink boxes, and there'd be this ice in there, and you could see the tops of the drinks. And
yeah, I always love to go to Mast when I'm in that part of North Carolina, Mast General Store, the old one, the really old one.
Yeah, and this thing's actually set between Boone and Blowing Rock.
Yeah.
So when Blackburn was 14, he and his father worked side by side, hoeing, baling, feeding, mucking. There's always something more a farm demanded. During a full day's work, they would exchange a handful of words. His father had never been much for talking, smiling for that matter. If Blackburn spilled milk or missed weeds, his father's words were few but severe. When the job was well done, the most Blackburn hoped for was a nod, including on a blistering August Saturday after the two of them alone harvested half an acre of cabbage. Cutting the heads from the cobby stalks was work enough, but carrying the burlap sacks from the bottomland up to the shed was even harder. On those summer Saturdays, his father left after supper to sit with other men who gathered at Hampton's store. When he returned, he always brought Blackburn and his sister a bottle of soda pop. Blackburn never asked to go with him, never thought to ask. But on that August Saturday, supper eaten, he fetched his hat and a lantern and looked at Blackburn. "You coming or not?" he'd said, walking out the door without waiting for a response. His father had long legs, and Blackburn trailed behind him. But as the store came into sight, his stride shortened until they walked together. Once there, his father stopped, took a nickel from the change purse, held it out. "You ain't going to get it for me?" Blackburn asked. His father shook his head. On the porch, the men Blackburn passed barely acknowledged him, though all spoke or nodded to his father. Inside, Mrs. Hampton was behind the counter. His father tipped his hat before turning to the metal drink box. Blackburn watched him lift the lid, peer at the metal caps before shoving his hand into the gray slush, fetching out a green bottle with 7-Up on its side. After freeing the cap, his father took a swallow as if testing the drink's quality, then paid and went outside. Blackburn read the cap names. Some he'd never tasted. Cheerwine, Knee-High, Yoo-Hoo. Each time he pulled a bottle from the slush, the surrounding caps swayed like fishing bobbers. He settled on a Cheerwine, gave Mrs. Hampton the nickel, went out. His father leaned against the porch rail. Chairs were filled, so several men perched beside his father on the railing. Others sat on the steps, leaving a gap for customers to pass. Blackburn went down the steps. Wooden drink crates were stacked beside the porch, and Blackburn turned one onto its side and sat. The men spoke of crops and weather, told a few jokes, tall tales. At 8 o'clock, Mrs. Hampton turned off the lights and locked the door. But the men lingered. The darkness made the men quieter, often attentive to a single voice. On the third Saturday night, a new man joined the regulars. As Blackburn passed, he'd elbowed the fellow beside him, spoke, and then laughed. His father told Blackburn to go on inside. But through the screen door, he heard him clearly. That's my son, and he's already more the man than you'll ever be. If you say another word to or about him, I swear before God, one or the both of us will end up in a hospital or a casket. You understand? Stranger answered, yes, sir. His father had come in the store then, got the 7-Up, but waited until Blackburn bought his drink. They went back out together. The chairs of the stranger and the man who sat beside them were empty. Which one you want? His father had asked.
That's so powerful. When you are writing a scene like that, before you write a scene like that, do you draw on your memory or do you actually go walk through the setting?
A lot of that was memory. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
as I say, that was just such, I just remember that so much. And I remember how icy cold sometimes it almost hurts you to get that bottle out, you know.
Yeah.
But I also remember it was just this magic because the caps were different colors, you know, and they did kind of sway around, you know, a little bit like fishing bobbers, or at least that was the simile I thought worked.
This might be a good time to talk about voice, because voice is what we have talked about previously, and dialect, and I could hear that in your reading. So one of the starting points that I've used with, I've interviewed Silas for this podcast. I've interviewed Crystal Wilkinson. Georgella has that word voice place. Mm-hmm. And I've been asking everybody about their voice place. Like what cultivated your voice place and the voice place you use as a writer? Who and what cultivated that for you?
Well, I would say, and actually that's the setting of this novel. My grandparents' farm was between Blowing Rock and Boone, actually still borders the Parkway. As a child, I spent a lot of time up there. And actually as an adolescent, I mean, I would spend large parts of my summer, and sometimes it'd just be my grandmother and myself on the farm alone. A lot of relatives right around there. And, you know, I'd go off sometimes for hours, and you know, if I got hungry, I might go to, you know, cousins, step in and they'd always give me something to eat if I were, you know, a couple of miles away, because I'd fish a lot. Just hearing it from, as a kid, just absorbing it, loving sometimes the wit, the sophistication of it. I always give this example, but it's so memorable. When I was about 16, I was with my uncle, who actually was a cabbage and tobacco farmer. And we were in Boone, and he saw me looking at at least by his standards, scantily clad young, probably Appalachian student, female Appalachian student. And he turned to me and said, "That girl hasn't got enough clothes on to wad a shotgun." Yeah, and I just love that, you know, and I mean, but that's really sophisticated. I mean, it's brilliant in its way. It's vivid, it's imaginative, it's creative, you know, all of that. And so I kind of look for that, and there always is a kind of tension mainly because of popular culture, how far you have to sometimes be careful about even in some ways, even if the language, the way it were really spoken, sometimes it could come off almost comic or cliched.
Yeah.
And I find sometimes I have to kind of back off that a little bit in a sense to not let the reader be able to kind of lapse into that kind of stereotypical mode of ignorance. But you can, a good writer works around it. Lee Smith talked about that she felt like dialect was like seasoning. You just sprinkle some in there and enough, and then the reader, it's not like you have to use apostrophes to say,
Right.
instead of saying use USE. I mean, the reader is not going to hear that D anyway.
Or one grammatical phrase like "I seen it."
Yeah,
That's just enough to get a sense of where you are.
Yeah, absolutely.
I can relate. I think a lot of us can relate to that idea of our grandparents or the older folks, talking to us. And for me, and I think for you too, a lot of it happened around work. Like when we were working in the tobacco fields when I was little, and I helped standing among the folks while they were grating tobacco leaves in the barn and listening to the stories, or we were making molasses, and you're just being filled with that. You don't know it at the time. I didn't realize the sophistication, like you said, of dialect until I was actually transcribing in my adult years, transcribing my great grandmother's voice. And that's when I realized the sophistication of the syntax and the words. And I thought, man, I've been listening to this my whole life and I haven't appreciated it for what it is,
Absolutely.
So since I mentioned work, that was one of the questions I wanted to ask you is I think I see a pattern of work in your novels where you really take time with a task and you walk the reader through a task. And I just wondered about that. Like I'm thinking of the Cove and when they dug the well, and then I'm thinking about Blackburn digging the graves. Why do you do that? Is it a chance for us to, because I know when you're alone and you're working, you think. You think. When you're with somebody and you're working, I think if I'm recalling correctly with the Cove, it was two people working, but it was a tension that you used work to build.
Oh, yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about that, about how you use the process of work? And then it's just interesting to know a process you don't know much about,
Yeah, and I think that's something I've learned about fiction, that people read fiction, which is a big lie, but they read it to learn about real things. And I think Robert Morgan does this probably better than any writer I know, as far as probably writes about work about as well as anyone. But I think readers tend to be curious, and I think sometimes if you want the book to be as vivid as possible, those kind of details. I mean, you don't want to get to the point where the reader gets bored, but I think those details just kind of make us believe the whole book, that we're really getting that. And also, I think that they can work on certain, I don't like the word symbol, but resonance. There's a kind of resonance, for instance, in the Cove when I have those characters kind of digging deeper into this place. I mean, the character who's not from that place, Walter, it's like there's a kind of fear in him of kind of being kept in this place. So there's a kind of tension there. He's also working with a man who, if the man really knew Walter's background, might just leave him in there. So I think that can work sometimes in a very interesting way. And certainly in the new novel, Grave Digging for Blackburn, because I think what in that book, I think it shows several things. I think it shows, one, by showing how meticulous he is digging the grave. I think that really gives us insight into his character, that it matters to him that he does this right for the deceased and the deceased
It's
family.
an act of love. It's not just work. It's an act of love. Exactly.
And, one thing that definitely was back in the back of my mind as I was working on that scene was when my father's buried. I buried up there in Aho, my mom now too. But when my father died, he had a traditional casket, and it was my relatives and some men in the community who dug that grave. And to me, that kind of ties into actually the scene I just read before. How do men of that generation show their love? Well, they're not going to say, "Gosh, I really love this, this man," but they're going to do it with their hands.
That's it. You're absolutely right. I'm also thinking of dead Confederate. I know this is a switch, but I'm also thinking of dead Confederates and the digging. Great story in Burning Bright, the collection Burning Bright. So the cemetery, okay, you said you didn't like the word symbol. I have to ask why. Why don't you like the word symbol? Because I was about to use it.
Well, it just sounds like, you're stamping something on a story saying, look, it means more. But
oh, yeah.
Yeah, but resonance. I mean, I think that's the word I like, because I think when, obviously, like going back to the Covey, I did it when he's digging this grave. Yeah, not digging that well. He's digging a well, but also you hope the reader also senses, because he's starting to feel so claustrophobic when he's down in there.
Yeah,
the sense that this place, which is already kind of a dark valley, there's a part of him that's really kind of sense of being trapped.
Mm-hmm. So I grew up around death and death ritual because my grandfather worked for the funeral home. So he did everything from digging to embalming to greeting people at the funeral home. So I was around that a lot. The old folks, they would talk about death like a matter of fact. It wasn't, they didn't shy away from it. So I'm fascinated. I was so excited when I saw this coming. I got this alert that it was coming and I could pre-order it. And here's what it was about. And I was like, oh man, that's right up my alley. Because I teach a course here called The Rhetoric of Death in Appalachia.
Wow.
And it's all about how our rituals and how we process death. And so I was really interested in the cemetery scenes and the iconography that you talk about on the gravestones. Can you talk about, and let me see if I'm saying this right, Philpot? Is that how you pronounce it?
Yeah.
Okay, it makes an appearance several times. Can you talk about the significance of that?
Sure. And actually, I want to come back, but let me tell you, I'll say this first, because I think we're getting here. Like you, my grandparents' farm, it was kind of a low-lying valley, not really a valley, but there were ridges around it. But on the ridge right above our pasture farmhouse was a church and a cemetery. And it still is there. And one thing that was interesting was there was only a barbed wire fence between the cemetery and our land. And so when there would be a storm, sometimes wreath, flowers would be blown over onto the land, our land. And when I was a kid, my grandmother would say, go up there. If you see anything up there, put it back over. And do it. I mean, she didn't use the word reverently, but she made that very clear. And I didn't know exactly which, it was a small cemetery, but I didn't know which flowers went where, but I just would very carefully put them back over on the other side put through the strands of the fence. And I actually had a relative who had been killed in World War II who was buried up there. And I think that kind of tied in subconsciously to this novel, knowing a veteran. But so, I mean, it's kind of interesting what you were talking about, that it was just kind of, and it wasn't scary.
Mm-hmm. Right, but no.
It was just, like you say, this was just kind of part of being connected to this place and to these people who kind of came before us. But going on, so that was important. But the Philpot, I thought, actually, when I was working early on this novel, I thought about calling it the sun and the cross, because what makes the Philpot so interesting is that it can be interpreted as either the sun, S-U-N, resurrection, or it can be, almost like a wavy cross. And in the novel, there's this little moment where Naomi is talking about that with Blackburn, and she says, do you think it looks like a sun or a cross? And for her, she sees it as a sun. And I think that says a lot about her. And Blackburn's not sure. Blackburn doesn't quite see it that way. And I think for him, it becomes more of a cross. And I think as you get deeper into the book, you start to realize that why he might more identify with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we don't want to spoil it for people that just know.
But I'm glad you picked up on that, because that's and Blackburn, I mean, it does play a prominent role, that particular symbol on the tombstone.
Yeah. Yes, as they do. Yeah, that's one of the things that I am really fascinated by, is how we make meaning because gravestones are for the living, not for the dead. I mean, they communicate. And this is a little aside, but I found in my family, they talked about a slave, they called it the slave cemetery in the woods behind my grandmother's house. And I never really thought much about it until I was older. And then I went back and it's, I mean, I've done a GPR reading of the ground with a physicist, and I've had an archaeologist come look at it, and we've been trying to research and find out who was buried there. But it's covered in vinca, and it's just all it is stones. So all you have to read are the size of the stones and the shape of the stones and how they're arranged, and that's how they're communicating. And so you have to take all the context and think, how am I to read this space? You know, and I've been working on that since 2013, just trying to figure out who it is and how to write about it. And but they talked about it with some reverence, you know, and my great grandmother would tell my great grandmother, you know, the cornfield would go right up to where that burial ground is, and she would say, you know, never step into that space with your work tools, never hoe into that space. Really interesting. I'm just fascinated by that. So did you have to do much research on cemeteries and iconography, or did you just pull from your own experience?
No, I did. I mean, as far as the terminology, the terms, I mean, for the certain symbols, that was fun. I mean, but I've always kind of been interested in graveyards and gravestones, and so there's a really good book the University of North Carolina Press put out. So they have. It's this big, kind of a big book, and it's a couple hundred pages, but they have all sorts of stones, and they talk about the symbolism, you know, where it came from. Yeah, I find that fascinating.
I do too.
Yeah, it's just interesting. And I think readers in their own way find it interesting too. I mean,
yeah, this isn't about the Caretaker specifically, but I'm going back to Burning Bright, and my favorite story in Burning Bright, and I have to talk about it because I talk about it all the time to other people, so why not talk about it with the author, is the corpse bird. Yeah. Because we're talking about death and superstition, you know, we're talking about, well, you weren't talking about superstition, but and I had heard that too. And we talk about birds and bird imagery in Appalachia. My mom and I still freak out if a bird flies into the house, you know, because we know what that means. It's a bad omen. But the corpse bird is my favorite story. I mean, every story in that book is great. And when I teach it, my students, who, you know, you have to sort of nudge to read nowadays, they devour that book. They love that book. I just wanted to touch on the corpse bird for just a minute and ask you, is that just something you heard growing up that you incorporated into a story? I just love the contrast between this guy I think he's an engineer, and he's moved to Charlotte, and he's grappling with that part of him that's from back home that knows this isn't logical, but can't help, but it gets into his head.
Yeah, I mean, that once again, that kind of came out of that what I grew up with, my family and my grandparents, older relatives, and and I had some relatives who were very much. I mean, they very much believed certain things, certain omens. One, which was just, I've actually written a poem about, was where my uncle had a kind of premonition of his own death. And that his father, he saw a fox on the edge of his field, and the fox was acting very unusual. It just kind of sat there and stayed with him and watched him. And, you know, it wasn't rabid or anything, and he actually, my mother told my mother and my aunt, you know.
Yeah.
It happened. A couple of weeks later, he actually did die.
My great grandmother would hear bells before somebody died, and she would see people standing at the foot of her bed to foretell. That's what she was always right about it. Yeah, that's deep.
I think this book, it was a real struggle for some reason, but it did something. I'd always wanted to set a novel on my grandparents' farm because it's such an important place for me. I'd set stories there, certainly. A couple of stories, and actually the first and last stories in Burning Bright are both set on that farm. Yeah, this one kind of allowed me to kind of not let that place be forgotten, at least in my memory. Actually, when I got the book, I've got 2 aunts and 2 uncles still alive, and I sent them each copies because this was where they grew up. And in a way, since the book's set in 1951, this was the way it would have been when they were young.
Yeah.
And that meant a lot to me, being able to do that. The Korean War's kind of been or conflict has been kind of forgotten, but some of the people in Appalachia were, including one of my older relatives who was a Marine in Korea. So writing about that period was interesting. Kind of making a connection, polio and COVID was to me a little bit interesting. But so yeah, I think all of those things. The fact that so much of in that, unlike today, what we're doing right now, that so much was face to face, even lying to someone's face. You know, the idea of direct communication, which is some ways more dramatic. But yeah, just those kinds of things.
Yeah. This might be an odd question, but when I think of the Appalachian region, specifically cultural Appalachia, it's still very, very big. What does your corner of Appalachia mean to you? Like if you're trying to tell people about, because I teach an intro to Appalachian Studies course, and most of those students have never been here before now. And so when I try to talk about the complexity and the different spaces of Appalachia and the migration patterns, and what is it about Western North Carolina that you want people to know in terms of greater Appalachia?
Well, I think ultimately, I think this would be true of any really serious writer, is that you want to convey ultimately that in the deepest part of these people, they're fellow humans. I mean, that, if a reader from outside the region sees my characters as mere exotics, I failed. I mean, now, and I can, and in some ways write and even celebrate. I'll use, certain regional distinctions, language, food, music, dialect, all of those things. But ultimately, you're trying to do two things simultaneously. I think you're showing what makes this region distinctive, yet in the same time, you're also showing the people's connection to all other people. Endora Welty has this great quote, all one place comprehended helps us understand all other places better. Yeah. And I love that quote. So that would be it, I think, mainly. Giving, I would not presume to speak for all Appalachia. I would just say that my work is pretty much centered on my family and that their particular place in the region, and I've tried to convey that as truthfully as I can.
I've spent the good part of the past year coming and going to Blowing Rock because my son is fascinated by steam engines. Oh, yeah. So all he wanted was a season pass to Tweety, and so I went to Tweety when I was little in the 70s and Land of Oz. And so that part of that was my connection to Blowing Rock in particular. And then my family's from Hickory. So North Carolina is really special. Western North Carolina is really special to me for those reasons. But growing up there, I'm just curious about someone who lives there and grew up there, what your perception of Tweety Railroad and the Land of Oz and those places. Did you go? Did you?
Oh, yeah. Well, I had relatives who worked at Tweety. My aunt was, in summer when she was in college, she would work there. So, yeah, I had other relatives. And actually, there's a trout stream that runs right in front of Tweety, and I fish that all the time. So,
okay.
And it was interesting because in Ajo, and actually, I just went to my aunt's funeral about a month ago. One of my aunts died, and we were at the cemetery, and I heard Tweety. I heard the whistle. You could hear the whistle from the farm where, that was kind of an interesting thing to see this kind of, these tourist places and the people that would come in. I actually wrote a story in my in one of my collections about Tweety in there, and someone who works there in the summer. Yeah, that was interesting. And also because our land was adjacent to the Blue Ridge Parkway, sometimes when I was a kid, my cousins and I would go up on the hilltop and look down on the parkway, and we'd play a game where we would try to guess the tags.
Oh.
Usually tags from, Massachusetts, Florida, Arizona. And, you couldn't cheat, and you couldn't pick North Carolina or Tennessee. So you'd have to pick a different state. And that was actually, I wrote an article about this nonfiction piece about, as a kid, just kind of thinking, you'd watch these cars go by and you'd think about all these places these people lived, and you're kind of in this little place up here in Western North Carolina. And And I ended the article saying that, now, as looking back on my life, where I've been to other countries and other places, and that the most magical place always was here.
Yeah. No place like home. Right. Where did that article appear? I want to find it.
I think it was in Garden and Gun.
Okay.
Garden and Gun, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, it was, yeah.
One last thing I'm thinking of, I'm thinking about your poem. I think it's New and Collected Poems. It's the Green Book.
Mm-hmm.
I'm thinking, and I can't remember the title. This just came to me. I didn't bring that with me, but I'm thinking this poem just will not leave me. It's a poem about a woman who is taken to a junkyard, and she finds, tell me the story behind that. She finds a car that someone she loved apparently died in. That doesn't said explicitly, but she's putting her foot on the brake at the end. It's powerful.
Yeah, that's it's called that Reed Hartley's Junkyard, and that was actually based on my first cousin Jeff. When we were teenagers, I was 2 years older, and on his graduation night, he wrecked, died, and that was just that kind of a devastating moment for our whole family, obviously. And so there's a sequence of poems in that book called Raising the Dead, where about that and about the family. And actually the aunt that I heard, she died about a month ago, and that was her son. Yeah, that poem was about that, about her, and just the grief of our family had at that time. And it was interesting. I think writers, I think Graham Greene said, right, every writer has to have a sliver of ice in his heart or something like that. And I've never censored myself, never, except for one time. I wrote a sequence. If you read the Raising Dead, you'll see there's a sequence. I think it's 10 poems, all about that, about the family and about repercussions of that wreck. And I've never done this before since, but I gave them to my aunt, and I said, if you're not comfortable with my publishing these, I won't. And she said, since Jeff died, it's like people don't even want to acknowledge he existed. They don't want to bring him up. It's like, they're doing this they think kindness, but it's almost like, and she said, and at least these poems, they acknowledge he existed. And so she wanted them published, and so that.
I'm also thinking of one with a woman on a Ferris wheel and the lightning behind her. Such good poetry.
I always enjoy coming up your way, and Gil Blackburn, who's up there too. He's one of those great teachers who changed my life. Wasn't much of a high school student, but when I got to Garden Way of Gil and a woman named Joyce Brown, a really good poet, Appalachian poet, they both were there, and they kind of, not kind of, they really enriched my life, and kind of gave me, as I say, I wasn't a very good student in high school, and gave me a certain confidence that, maybe I wasn't just a complete loser. Maybe something was going on in my head,
Oh, he would brag about you. I haven't seen Gil in a while, but he would brag about you so much. He was good to me as a provost when he was provost here too. But he liked to brag on you. Yeah, we'll have you back. If you'll come, we'll have you back for sure. I remember, I'll just say this before we close out and make a plug for Serena too, for any listeners that haven't read Serena. You came and you talked about the research that you did many years ago. You talked about the research you did with the eagle. It was an eagle, not a hawk, right? That she hunted with. And that was a fascinating story. That you actually traveled out. Was it out west? You've had to find
the guy
falcon. It was a falcon, right?
No, it was an eagle. The guy had an eagle. Yeah, he hunted. The guy who kind of was my main source. Hunted with an eagle out in Wyoming, and he kind of was my mentor. He taught me how to train an eagle, I guess you would say.
That's wonderful. Yeah. Serena's a great book. Well, it's so good to see you and so good to talk to you, and congratulations on the new novel.
Thank you for having me.
All right. Thank you. can go to our Patreon account at Talking Appalachian and become a subscriber. And there you'll get bonus content, and you'll also get any merchandise that we offer to subscribers. Thanks for listening, and remember to keep talking Appalachian.